and post-absorptive states. And as we speak about the absorptive and post-absorptive states, I like to consider these or compare these to the fed or the fasting state. So the absorptive state is the fed state. This is where energy is being stored as macromolecules. And you can consider this or compare this to a state of being fed, or if you just had a really large meal and you begin to mobilize those macromolecules to be stored as energy for a later period. The post-absorptive state, or the fasting state, is where these energy stores are now being mobilized and broken down so that we can liberate energy because we're not currently eating. So the fed state is if you just had a large meal, you absorbed what you needed, and then you're storing the rest away for later. And then the fasting state is if you haven't had a meal for a long time, you're in need of energy, and you're going to tap into those storage areas, that storage reservoir, to mobilize that energy until you can get to another meal, okay? And we can really kind of think about this in just kind of caveman days, right? Where we go for a long period of time without food. And so the body has to tap into one of these two states in order to put food away for later or to tap into those stores until we can get to our next meal. All right, so during the absorptive or fed state, our energy input exceeds our output as nutrients are being absorbed. Glucose is going to be the primary energy source for our cells, and then excess nutrients that we're not using at that time will be put away into our cells to be stored for a later time. This happens in the liver and the muscle, which stores that glucose up in the form of glycogen, as well as in our fat tissues, our adipose cells, that stores that fat up. Sometimes amino acids and glucose can also be stored as triglycerides, again, for a later time. Let's look at this flow chart. So this flow chart really summarizes what's taking place in the fed state or in the absorptive state. So we take in a large meal. Let's say you had a large meal, you had a lot of glucose in that meal, some fatty acids or fats in that meal, and then a considerable amount of protein in that meal as well. As you bring that into your GI system, you break it down into smaller pieces, and you start absorbing these macromolecules. Glucose is going to move into most of our body cells. And so the body's going to kind of take what it needs at that time and make energy, right? This is the process of glycolysis. We take carbon dioxide and water, we make energy, and we use what we need at that time in most of our body cells. The rest of this can sort of be stored away for later. So in our liver and muscles, we store away that excess glucose as glycogen. In our liver and our fat tissue, we can take some of that glycogen, convert it to glycerol. Our fatty acids, we also break down. Remember, there's fat in that meal, and we break down those fatty acids, and we can combine glycerol and fatty acids to make triglycerides, right? Triglycerides are going to be the main storage unit for excess energy or for excess calories or excess nutrients. On the other hand, we can take our proteins from that meal, we break them down to amino acids, and we can do one of two things. We can send this to tissues such as the muscle, sometimes the heart muscle as well, and we can make proteins from those amino acids depending on the body's metabolic needs at that time. And then we can take the excess amino acids, we can shunt those off to the liver, and we can convert those to fatty acids. And that can also be converted to triglycerides, okay? So the big picture here is that we're taking all of our nutrients from our meal, we're using what we need at that time, so we're liberating glucose that we need at that time to make energy, liberating amino acids to make whatever proteins we need at that time, and then we're really storing the rest away as triglycerides. So fat tissue or adipose tissue or triglycerides is the main area or the main unit that we use to store away our nutrients for a later time. And that's why we sort of start to put on weight if we're eating excess amount of calories per day, because the main place to put those nutrients is into our fat tissues. Okay, that's the main storage form and the main storage area. Okay. Let's move now to speak about the post-absorptive state. So this is what I compare to being the fasted state. And this is where we've gone for a long period of time. We're not bringing in a meal. We don't have any nutrients coming in. And so we need to kind of tap into those storage areas to liberate energy, to keep ourselves alive, to sustain metabolic processes. So this is where the energy output exceeds the energy input. Glucose is going to be spared for the nervous system, and then other tissues such as muscle and our other glands and so on, they can sort of liberate fatty acids to use energy from those fats. The brain cannot use fatty acids, at least not as adequately as it can use glucose. So the brain really, really prefers glucose. And we describe the brain as being glucose dependent in this way, that it cannot use amino acids, it cannot use fatty acids or triglycerides. It really can only use glucose, and then to a very small extent, it can sometimes tap into what we call ketones, which are the breakdown products or byproducts of fatty acids, and that can use or that can liberate a smaller amount of energy, but overall the brain really prefers glucose, okay? And then the stored nutrients that we put away during the fed state can now be mobilized to give us energy until we can get to another meal. So here's another really nice summary flow chart that kind of summarizes what happens in the post-absorptive state. So we're tapping into our stored macromolecules here, and we can tap into proteins, which are coming from our muscles. Now, this is a very rare occurrence. The body does not like to break down proteins. This is going to be one of the last resorts to tapping into energy reserves. In fact, we prefer to tap into fat and then tap into glycogen. And then as a last resort, we tap into muscle. Okay, muscle breakdown is going to be one of the most, the last or final storage areas that we tap into for energy during the fasted state. But in any occurrence, we tap into this muscle, we break that down to amino acids. Amino acids can be mobilized, broken down via proteolysis to liberate energy for cellular work. We can tap into our adipose tissues by breaking down those triglycerides into its fatty acid and glycerol components. The fatty acid component, again, can be mobilized to make energy via lipolysis. The glycerol can do one of two things. We can either break that down in the liver to make ketones, and the ketones I talked about earlier as being kind of a backup source of fuel for the brain. It can't use that to a large extent, but it can use a few of those ketones to make some energy. And then glycerol can also be converted to glucose via another pathway, okay? And then we can tap into the liver, break down some of that stored glycogen to liberate glucose. And glucose can obviously be the main source of fuel for all of our tissues, but more importantly for our nervous tissue, for the brain. Like I mentioned earlier, the brain really prefers glucose as its energy reservoir or energy liberation. And then we can also tap into muscle here, break down some of that glycogen, right? Glycogen is stored in the muscle and liver, and then again, shunt that to become glucose, and then glucose, we said, we can break down to liberate energy, okay? So this is how we tap into those storage areas, mainly our adipose tissue. I wanna stress that. We really tap into adipose tissue first, and then some of what we got stored in the liver and muscle in order to liberate energy to do work. And then to a lesser extent, we can liberate some of the amino acids that are coming from our muscles, the protein that's in our muscles, to make amino acids to liberate energy as well. Alrighty, okay. And this is how we can sustain ourselves during the fasting or the post-absorptive state. And this is why, although you've gone for a long period without food, you can really start tapping into some of those storage areas And so on the flip side of the coin, if you're not bringing in enough calories, this is where you start to lose some of your fat tissue. You also may lose some of your muscle mass as you liberate those energy storage areas to sustain your body by making ATP to keep you alive, essentially. Okay. So we'll speak a little bit about the overall regulation of the absorptive and post-absorptive states as it relates to the hormones that are involved in turning on and off those processes that I talked about earlier, such as proteolysis, glycolysis, and so on. So this happens under the influence of hormones, two hormones specifically, insulin being the hormone of the absorptive state or the fed state, glucagon being the hormone of the post-absorptive state or the fasted state. And these are two antagonistic hormones, meaning that they're going to be in this sort of yin and yang balance. If I just had a large meal, I'm going to increase my insulin production, decrease my glucagon production. If I haven't had a large meal for a while, or if I haven't eaten for a while, I'm going to decrease my insulin production and increase my glucagon production, okay? And then other important regulators are going to be epinephrine. You know, epinephrine is involved in the sympathetic system, the sympathetic influence, so that fight or flight response. And then the sympathetic nervous system is also an important regulator of the fed versus fasted state. And we'll talk about how that comes about. So let's look at the role of insulin. So insulin is one of our peptide hormones. It's secreted from the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. So basically we've got this pancreas, it's one of the glands in the endocrine system, but it is also an exocrine gland. We talked about the pancreas having dual function. It secretes exocrine production, as well as these groups of cells that we call the islets of Langerhans. This is a collection of that group of cells, and they secrete hormones which actually enter the blood. So this is going to be an endocrine part of the pancreas. And so the action of insulin is to build up energy stores. It is an anabolic hormone. So it's going to help to synthesize glycogen, synthesize triglycerides, basically store that energy away for a later time. That is why it's a hormone of the absorptive or the fed state. It's going to promote glucose use for energy, whatever we need at that time, and then increase glucose uptake for usage or for storage. And then it's also going to decrease catabolism, which is the breakdown of these energy storage reservoirs, because obviously when we're in the absorptive state, we're not catabolizing, we're not breaking down, we're basically using what we need and storing the rest. Okay. And I want to just point out these beta cells. So the beta cells that we can see here are the actual cells of the group of Langerhans that are secreting insulin. We've got other cells that are part of these islets of cells that secrete other hormones, which I'll talk about as well. Okay, let's look at some of the functions of insulin. It's going to increase glucose in the plasma, increase amino acids in the plasma. It is going to incite the parasympathetic system, so that's the rest and digest. So again, you should be making that connection of the absorptive state, the rested state, the digestive state, which is all controlled with insulin and the parasympathetic system. It's also going to turn on what we call GIP, or insulin-dependent insulinotropic peptide, which is also helping us to store away some of our energy reserves, depending on when that comes into the stomach, comes into the body. Secretion decreases during the post-absorptive state. So if we haven't had a meal for a long amount of time, we tone down our secretion of insulin. Okay, we're not trying to store things away if we're not bringing in calories, if we're not bringing in food. And so we tone down insulin release during the post-absorptive state, which is turning off the parasympathetic nervous system and turning on the sympathetic nervous system. Again, that comparative secrecy, or that antagonistic way that these two hormones and these two divisions of the nervous system are kind of competing with each other, okay? So as we can see here, the beta cells secrete insulin, and insulin is doing these main four things: glucose uptake from the brain, the liver, and muscle, amino acid uptake, protein synthesis from that amino acid uptake, and then we're going to stop or decrease protein breakdown. In our fat tissue, we're going to increase fatty acid, triglyceride synthesis, and we're going to decrease lipolysis. In the liver and muscle, we're going to increase glycogen synthesis and we're going to decrease glycogenolysis. And then in the liver, we're going to increase fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis again, and we're going to decrease gluconeogenesis, okay? So we're decreasing these processes: gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, lipolysis, and protein breakdown or proteolysis. We're decreasing these processes because this is not ideal at this time. If we just had a large meal, if we're storing these biomolecules up, it is counterintuitive, it is counterproductive to be breaking that down at the same time. So while we're storing these things up, we're going to stop the breakdown of these macromolecules by turning off these processes that I mentioned here.